Right now, the Game of the Year conversation feels like a tug of war between two games, Hollow Knight Silksong and Clair Obscur Expedition 33. For a lot of people, it's a genuine debate. Silksong has the legacy, the years of anticipation, the passionate community behind it. Expedition 33, on the other hand, came out of nowhere, a debut game from a brand new studio that somehow launched to near universal acclaim. To most people, this is a close contest. But to me, it isn't. I think Expedition 33 is going to win, and more than that, I think it needs to. Not just for the award itself, but for what a win like this would mean for the industry. Now, sure, when the nominees are announced, we're going to see more than just these two games. Death Stranding 2, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, maybe even a surprise indie will make the list. But I think it's fair to say that this year's Game of the Year race is a two-horse race. Expedition 33 isn't just another strong release, it's the very first game Sandfall Interactive has ever made. Now that matters, because when a new studio arrives with their debut game, the expectations we have are usually quite modest. At best, you hope to see flashes of promise, a few ideas that hint at what the team might accomplish in the future, but Sandfall didn't just deliver promise, they delivered polish, cohesion, and a complete vision. At least enough so that it was able to place Expedition 33 amongst the highest reviewed games of the year, and at one point the highest reviewed game ever released. Now you don't need me to tell you that that kind of debut doesn't happen very often. Now sure, some people are going to argue that Silksong has the edge simply because of its following. It's one of the most anticipated sequels of the decade after all, and that kind of hype is impossible to ignore. So let's not ignore it. The Silksong hype is definitely real, the fanbase is massive, the passion behind it is undeniable, and yeah, I even understand people flexing the fact that it was able to crash several storefronts when it finally released. But here's the thing, it's a sequel. Performing well in sales and hype is expected for a game like that. I mean, that's literally what the media landscape always banks on, which is why sequels and remakes are dominating media right now. Clair Obscur is none of that. It wasn't expected, it wasn't riding on 6 or 7 years of anticipation, and it most certainly didn't have the safety net of being an established IP. It's brand new, it's original, and quite frankly, it's bold. And honestly, using popularity as a way to determine which game is going to win Game of the Year isn't quite a good way of going about doing things. You see, popularity might be able to get a game nominated, sure, but it doesn't guarantee a win. Spider-Man 2 sold incredibly well last year, a lot more than Astro Bot, yet it still lost. Tears of the Kingdom was the sequel to one of the most acclaimed games ever made, but it didn't win either. Heck, even back in 2020, on this very channel, I remember doing a live stream watching the Game Awards, and we were shocked watching it live when we saw The Last of Us Part 2 win Game of the Year, despite how much discourse surrounding that game that year had been extremely negative.
How did this game win so many awards? I want to know who voted for this game. I want to know. Don't be afraid. I don't hate you. But I want to know who voted for this game. Somebody tell me who the fuck voted for this game.
Now, if it was the first Hollow Knight game that was pitted against Expedition 33, well, to me, that would be an even more insane matchup than this, and far more of an actual balanced conversation. But it isn't. And so that's where Expedition 33, in my view, gains the upper hand, because it stood entirely on its own, and yet it still managed to eclipse almost everything else in terms of critical reception. That's the kind of impact that I'm confident is going to matter when the judges are making their decision. And this is where the conversation goes beyond just two games. Because as far as I'm concerned, Game of the Year shouldn't only just be about recognition. It should also be about sending a message to the industry. Indie developers are already thriving. Games like Hollow Knight proved years ago that small teams can build experiences as rich and memorable as anything from a major publisher. When we look at the indie scene, I'm sure most of us can agree that space is alive and well, with many of the games that come out of it considered to still be keeping the classic gaming spirit. But AAA? Well, that's where a lot of the cracks are showing. Budgets are ballooning, studios are shying away from taking as much risk, and too many of the big releases feel like they're built on formulas instead of vision. That's why Expedition 33 matters. It's a debut game built at AAA scale with AAA ambition, and yet it carries the freshness and artistry we normally associate with only indie games. If that type of game can win Game of the Year, then it sends a clear signal. It doesn't take decades of sequel building to make something extraordinary. And if a brand new studio can outshine some of the biggest names in the industry with their very first attempt, even including one of the most highly anticipated sequels in gaming, then the excuse of only turning to safe sequels and rehashed remakes suddenly looks a lot harder to justify. Now, just to further solidify my point, let's not forget that when Baldur's Gate 3 was going to launch, a lot of Western developers rushed to Twitter to say, "Don't treat this as the new baseline." They basically pointed to all of its advantages. The fact that they had the Dungeons and Dragons license, Larian's experience with the Divinity games, the fact that they had a big team, that it's sprawling and complex, and in their view, Baldur's Gate 3 was an anomaly, not a standard. But you see, with the success of Expedition 33, well, now suddenly, those excuses don't quite hold up so well anymore. Again, this isn't a legacy studio with a famous IP. It's a brand new team with around 30 core developers making their very first game. And instead of a massive, endlessly branching RPG, Expedition 33 took a different path. It's more linear, more focused, and in many ways, I would argue, more approachable. I think that for a lot of players, that structure actually made it easier to follow the story through to its conclusion, making it a lot easier to stay engaged, and as a result, even easier to fall in love with. The combat, the presentation, the imagination, all of it proves that you don't need a Dungeons and Dragons license. You don't need a 400-person team, and you most certainly don't need to build one of the most complex RPGs ever made. As I've already said, what you need is vision, artistry, and execution, and that's why its win matters, because it destroys this whole Baldur's Gate 3 was just a AAA anomaly cop-out and shows that greatness is achievable even under circumstances far leaner than what most AAA studios operate with. There's also the story behind the games themselves. As I said already, Silksong has been expected for several years, so it's the safe favourite, the sequel that everybody saw coming and everyone is certain is going to win. Expedition 33 is the opposite. It's the underdog. It's a debut title that no one had on their radar until it suddenly arrived and surpassed every expectation. Well, almost no one. And if there's one thing the Game Awards love, it's a narrative. Because let's be real, if anything other than Silksong wins, there's going to be an inevitable explosion of reactions online. There's going to be rants, there's going to be unironic crash outs, and if we're being totally honest, just the potential drama that could come from such an anticipated game being beaten by a newcomer is exactly the kind of moment people are going to remember long after the ceremony ends. And beyond the industry story, there's the game itself. Expedition 33 isn't only polished, it's thematically rich, its painterly art style and focus on grief and unexpected yet heartfelt family drama, it all gives it a weight and freshness that critics and players both felt. And it isn't just the story that sets the game apart. It's a Western RPG, but one that openly wears its JRPG influences on its sleeves. I mean, it has turn-based combat, which is a system that even many of the Japanese developers of today are starting to pull away from. That blend of depth and freedom that we usually get in Western RPGs, but with the heart and soul of a JRPG, is part of why it feels so distinct. And if I'm going to be really honest, this one aspect alone, for me, is a massive part of why I believe it should win. Because as a JRPG fan, I've been desperate to finally see Western developers make a real go at making a title with that JRPG soul, but at a level that could stand beside the very best of its inspirations. But one reason that particularly stands out as being incredibly significant to me is that no debut title has ever won Game of the Year at the Game Awards. We've seen sequels, spiritual successors, even surprise indie hits like Hades win, but never before a studio's very first game. If Expedition 33 takes the award this year, it wouldn't just be a victory for Sandful Interactive, it would be a first in the show's history. Game of the Year isn't just a trophy, it sets a precedent. It says, this is what we as gamers want the industry to notice. This is the kind of game that defines the moment. If a brand new studio wins with their very first game, it would be a significant statement. Now, none of this is to say that Silksong doesn't deserve recognition. It does, but I would argue it already has that. The original Hollow Knight already won something far more lasting than any award. It won the hearts of players around the world. That game cemented itself as one of the most defining indies and quite frankly video games of the last decade. And Silksong will no doubt continue that legacy. But that's exactly why I think Expedition 33 should take Game of the Year. Silksong doesn't need the win to prove its place in gaming history, but Expedition 33 does. A victory here wouldn't just be about one game, it would be about showing that a debut studio can rise from nowhere and set a new standard for what's possible. And to me, that's the kind of moment the Game Awards are made for.